Alright, how's it going, y'all? So this right here is the new, incredibly long-awaited update to the MacBook Pro lineup with the new M1 Pro chip in there. And for me, it is an unbelievably powerful laptop that can do way more than anything I would expect out of a laptop. But that is for me, specifically somebody who's creating content like YouTube videos. But that might not necessarily be true for you, depending on your workflow and what you're actually using it for. I'm going to get into that all later and talk about why you can't really necessarily use traditional benchmarks that you would have in the past to really judge this laptop. You're really going to have to look for benchmarks in your specific workflow because it kind of cheats in an unbelievable way by using some really great features within the new M1 Pro chip and M1 Max chip. And so I'm going to get to that later on and talk about that. But this is going to kind of be a review. It's not going to be one of those incredibly test-heavy reviews where it's like, these are the performance benchmarks. This is going to be really my experience using the laptop and how I felt with it. If you really want to go see those stats, that is for other people to make, and there's 1,000 videos like that out here. But this is really going to be me giving my experience, specifically as somebody who's been using it to create videos, as well as actually just using it on the go. So I'm somebody who's used MacBook Pro laptops for pretty much my entire life. I got my first MacBook Pro my freshman year of high school, and then my previous laptop that replaced this guy right here was actually the very first Touch Bar MacBook Pro, which was in 2016 MacBook Pro. And it was a 15-inch, and this is the 16-inch. And for me, upgrading to this thing has been unbelievable. It has been so nice in a lot of key areas for the way my workflow is. So I've now had this laptop for about a month now, and it actually came at a really key time. So I just relocated all the way across the country from Los Angeles, California, all the way to Huntsville, Alabama. And so we actually made that road trip. And so it came in just before I started that trip. And that's probably the best case test for this thing because we were driving across the country. My fiance, Katie, would be driving in the mornings generally. And I'd spend a couple hours every morning just editing videos, cleaning up stuff, trying to work on my backlog because, well, I've been traveling. I've not been having time to make a lot of videos. So I wanted to make sure I could still get my regular workflow out. And so this laptop was unbelievable in that circumstance. It was able to just rinse through all of the ProRes multicam 4K shots. So it's also multicam with multiple cameras in each scene. So I'll normally have the shot where it's my computer screen and then I'm in the lower right hand corner, and that's also multicam. So I've got one on my face, one on just the laptop. And so it was able to completely handle multiple streams of 4K footage, even when I've got picture-in-picture going on in some of those multicam streams. So I would probably be rendering up to 5 different camera streams, all 4K at the exact same time, while on battery power, just driving in the car, and it did not miss a beat. I would be able to edit for legitimately 2 hours in the car, and it would go down by maybe 20-30% battery life. That to me is unbelievably insane, and it really lets me utilize this thing a lot better. I also really love the upgrade to the keyboard. I probably had the single worst keyboard on a Mac laptop that they've had in a while, which was the 2016 Butterfly keyboard, where they really just wanted to cut every single millimeter out of the entire laptop's thickness. And so those keys just were horrible. Because of that keyboard, I actually always had to keep multiple cans of compressed air at my house because the amount of times that a single little piece of dust would get under the keycap and now you can't press a certain letter was all the time. It probably happened at least 2 or 3 times a month where I would just have to go spray out the entire keyboard and then it would work until another little piece got in there. It was not a great keyboard, it was terrible. This is a complete redesign from that. They've added in so many extra ports. They've added the ports, well, back, but they've said finally, okay, it's okay not to have the most razor thin laptop when you're going for the Pro model. When you've got a model that is supposed to be for pros, where it's actually supposed to be used for heavy workflows, and it's okay if it's like 10 millimeters thicker if you get a bunch of ports and features out of it. And so they finally realized to go that direction, and I really like it. I assume with the next MacBook Airs, they will definitely be having still the thin bodies, and that's perfect. For people who are just going to be writing Word documents and things like that, that is the perfect setup for you. You want a super thin laptop, and that's great. This is a Pro machine, and it is heavy. It is quite substantial, but it actually sits really well. There is a huge battery in this thing that's just honestly unbelievable. It's maxed out to what the TSA will actually allow you to take on a plane, and it can just give you unbelievable battery life. With workflows, I mean, I spent probably a week using a laptop pretty regularly without it really dying at all. Like I legitimately had to go through once we moved in and find my charger after a few days. And this was taking Zoom calls and this was doing everything and it just did not miss a beat. And that's probably one of the best features of this laptop for anyone at all. All right, so there are probably like 3 big controversial or like big changes to this thing that some people like, some people don't. And I guess I'm just gonna go over my opinion on them for having used it for a while now. So the first off by far is the notch on the screen. And I'll be honest with you, everybody's blowing this out of proportion in my opinion. It is completely not noticeable, especially I use dark mode, so I don't even notice it. And though there is the issue with the menus that Snazzy Labs figured out, really, I think you have to go through and find that to make it an issue, more so than just automatically. So for those of you who don't know, it doesn't handle when you've got a ton of menu bars across the screen super well. So those actual menu icons on the left pretty much get chopped off and just jump to the next section when you've got too many of them. But then if you've got too many of the small icons in the upper right hand corner, like your battery life and things like that, it can kind of glitch and you actually can lose some menu items. I don't run any of those apps that let you see every single aspect of your Mac up there. I actually really try to limit that stuff because it's honestly just distracting. And so for me, it is not an issue whatsoever. Also, the fact that the mouse just disappears behind it is exactly what I'd like it to do. Because it just feels like it's part of the screen and you're never going up there and just looking around for stuff and it just keeps everything linear. It would be so much more jarring if you're scrolling across the top of your screen and all of a sudden it jumped from one side to the other and it glitched. That would honestly be jarring. For me, when you're just up there with a menu, it still is tracking exactly the same width of the screen as is on the trackpad. And I really like that. The only argument that I can see is that it's way too large for what it is. And everybody's saying that it's because they want to add in Face ID later on. For me, honestly, Face ID is not that big of a deal. I like the fingerprint reader for a laptop really well. Maybe if I did have it, I would really grow to appreciate it. But I really like the ease of use. I can always just touch the power button right here and it logs me in instantaneously. I don't have to worry about anything like that. But honestly, the size of it is really not that big of a deal. Especially the way they set it up, where that entire menu bar is now just eternally there, even when you're a full screen app. So if you go up and open up a full screen application, you hit full screen on it, it actually is going to the very top. So if you go to the top right here, boom, they all come out. And then they disappear away. And because this display has an unbelievable contrast ratio, it is basically true black across that entire thing. And so you can't even see it. Then you can always go up to see the menu bars. And I think that is the perfect implementation of it because it's really just free real estate up there. And so now your menu doesn't cut into your stuff. It's just always up there, which I've actually liked really well. So the next controversial or big thing is the fact that they removed the touch bar. And so I am a big fan of the actual physical function keys up there. At first, I really wanted to love the touch bar. I tried to use it. I've tried to find a reason for it to be useful. I just couldn't. Really, it was nice for emojis. It was nice for a few times where, specifically in applications that you need it. And so the biggest time I used it that was actually useful is whenever you're screen sharing on a Mac and the Mac that you're screen sharing with has 2 different displays, you can go through and have one of them be your display that you're actually seeing. So it's not like crazy wide and you can see everything. And then on the touch bar, you would have the option to click back and forth between which screen you saw. And so that was really useful for me whenever I was going from my laptop to my desktop with 2 monitors, I would be able to use that. That was probably when I used it the most. There are a few things that were nice about it. Some people have said give us half-size function keys and add the touch bar. Honestly, function keys just work really well. I don't see a need to add in the touch bar. Maybe they could add something else later on or a small one or something like that, but I just think it requires too much integration with applications that it just never took off, and I don't think it necessarily works. So I'm actually happy with GoToRenants. It's so much quicker and easier to go through and use the physical keys rather than trying to mess around with the touch bar. Side note, I'm also very happy that it's now the reverse T design rather than the full blocky design for the up arrows. So that was really annoying for me actually. So I'm glad they've got it back because you never accidentally hit the side keys. All right, and so now finally the kind of controversial or big change is the return of Magsafe. So Magsafe is a great thing. It allows you to easily charge your Mac, and it really helps that case where you accidentally trip over the cable and you don't want to rip the entire port or even worse, your laptop off of the desk, breaking the screen. It has actually saved me, especially when I was in high school, a lot, to where somebody would just kick the cord out of your machine and it was not a big deal because the magnets would just go flying and your laptop was totally fine. So I really like it, but I also kind of do wish that Apple would pick a standard and keep it. And so I think it would be awesome if they integrated MagSafe with all the iPhones and all of the iPads and all the different laptops and phones that they've got, because I think it's a really great standard. How nice would it be if you could easily just like throw a magnet on your phone and it would just attach? It might not work because maybe the port would get a lot more lint in it, so I'm not sure about that, but I do think it would be very applicable for the iPad. The problem is now you've got multiple chargers, and at least this guy can be charged with either USB-C or with MagSafe, which I'm very happy with. Another thing is this cable is just really nice. It is braided and also it's hard to explain, but it is like one of the easiest cables to work with I've ever experienced. It's not rigid at all, and it just allows you to put it wherever it needs to, while also not being flimsy. It's really hard to explain, but it's really nice to use, and it just makes everything really nice. The one thing I do love about MagSafe is the little indicator that says, okay, if it's orange, your laptop's charging. If it's green, that means your laptop's fully charged. And if there's no light, that means your laptop's not charging. So that is just one of those things that's really nice to, at a glance, you can see exactly where your status is at. Next thing up is the speakers. I could go through here and play music on it over a microphone, but you don't get the experience of that. Really, all I can say is these speakers are just unbelievable. They just play everything really well, and they honestly sound as good as a $200 soundbar from Amazon. That's about as good as I can say, especially when you're up in front of it. You just get a really great experience. Now, if you also are in the room next to it, these things can go very loud and can legitimately fill a room with sound. Not like a massive room, but enough where even if you're across the room, maybe like 10, 15 feet away, you don't need it on full volume to fill the room, which is really impressive. Now on to kind of the more opinion-based side of things. In my experience, specifically with the raw power of the CPU and integrated chipset that Apple has made, this M1 Pro. So I have the M1 Pro chip with 32 gigs of RAM. And it is both unbelievably powerful and underwhelming depending on which reviews you see. So when the first M1 chip came out, it was unbelievably powerful for its class. So if you look at all the reviews, it was putting up incredible fights against laptops over its class. And so it was incredibly snappy, and really everything was just integrated super well. Another thing was it was able to run non-native apps incredibly quickly, which is incredibly important for the transition, but long-term is actually not that useful. So long-term with macOS, if they continue making these M1 chips, which I expect them to, you're not going to be running x86. Nobody's going to be writing x86 apps for macOS anymore, which means that it's kind of a null point. It's important for the transition, but eventually we want to get to a place where it doesn't really matter. And maybe they can even remove that accelerated capability from the chip, because nobody's going to have x86 apps running on these things, because nobody's going to be writing x86 apps for macOS. And so it got a lot of praise because it was able to run non-native apps so much better than Windows on ARM. And it was incredibly snappy for apps that were optimized for it already. But now we've got the Pro version of this. Those M1 chips were for the people who are going to take them to coffee shops and write scripts on them and write Word documents and do their homework and things that don't actually require that much oomph under the hood. This right here is a laptop for pro creators, people who are going to be running heavy applications who want to run them on macOS. And so this chip right here is incredibly powerful, especially for my workflow, but I'd still say the software is in beta. The hardware integration is probably there, but the software is still in beta. I don't think that macOS and all the applications you run on it are fully out of beta for Apple Silicon. I notice a lot more glitches, times of instability, freezes, crashes, and things like that than I did with my old x86 MacBook Pro. I'm not saying that it happens all the time, but I'm saying it's somewhat of a normal occurrence. I'd say every day probably, so every 2 or 3 hours of use, you're going to find a weird quirk that crashes or something like that. It's still not out of the full beta phase, I don't think. For example, I was taking a Zoom call on this with a client, so I was screen sharing, everything like that, and all of a sudden Zoom crashes. And I had to rejoin the call and everything like that. I have done hundreds of sessions over Zoom on my x86 Mac Pro desktop. Never once have had Zoom crash. The third client I did on this, Zoom crashed. It's not crashed since then, but it happened. And I've noticed that with a lot of other apps. 10 minutes before I was filming this, I had everything lock up and I actually had to reboot the machine. It is not where it's all the time and it's completely usable, but it crashes. And I am not used to that happening. Normally, if a Mac hangs, it comes back pretty quickly. But for this, I've actually had to force quit apps fairly often and things like that, which definitely tells me that it's not fully implemented in macOS yet. macOS is not fully ready for Apple Silicon. Now that being said, I will take this laptop 100% over my old laptop. This chip has some of the most powerful features in it specifically for video editors. So at the beginning of this video, I did talk about how it is an unbelievable machine for me, a video editor. But for a lot of people, it's not going to live up to the hype. And that's because Apple has these accelerated engines in there. And so pretty much what this is there are certain parts of the chipset, these custom pieces of silicon that actually are designed to do one very specific thing. Think of a GPU that is designed to give you graphics, right? But now they've got all these additional ones for specific workflows. There is a ProRes one. There is a H.264. I think there's an H.265 one. And they've got all these ones that are designed to accelerate encoding and decoding a video. And so when you can use those, it is unbelievable. I'm able to export something and compress it using a compressor faster on this laptop than I am on my Mac Pro with 16 CPU cores. It rinses through Final Cut footage. If it's in ProRes or even H.264, it will fly through any of that with stuff that will just outclass anything else you can buy. Because of those dedicated chipsets on there, it is just unbelievable to use. And so for things like that, for a video editor, I say 100% get one. They just make everything so fast for that kind of workflow. But for other people who don't fit my workflow, it might not be that good, even if they're video editors. There might not be an accelerator for B-Raw. And so for people who are using Blackmagic Raw and DaVinci Resolve to edit their videos, it might be pretty slow comparatively if you were to have that in ProRes. And so things like that, you really have to make sure you know exactly your workflow. And if it fits into it, it could be unbelievably powerful. Things that just blow you away by what you're able to do without a sweat. But if it doesn't, it's a great laptop either way, but it's not that just next generation leaving everything else in the dust behind it. It's just a really good laptop at that time. So I do wish they had added in more than 10 CPU cores, or at least give you the option to upgrade, though that would have made the SKU a lot more complicated because they are building each individual piece of silicon as an entire system on a chip. So it's not like you can have a ton of SKUs super easily because you just can't add components together. They actually have to be manufactured all on the exact same chip. So every single customization, like 16 gigs, 32 gigs, 64 gigs of RAM, all actually require their own specific SKU, and those all have to be pre-built at the factory with the exact configuration. That's why there are very few options when you're customizing these things, because it only works in specific ways. They don't want to have 15 different SKUs they've got to produce. That just gets more expensive and more difficult. And so that's probably why there's only 10 CPU cores on these things, because even the 8 CPU option that is in the 14-inch ones are actually 16 CPU dies that just have 2 of their cores deactivated, likely because they were binned. Basically, they didn't meet performance requirements or had some other kind of issue, one that made those 2 cores unusable for whatever reason. And so that's actually how you get the 8 CPU option. is actually physically the exact same chip, just with 2 of the cores turned off essentially. And so that way they really only have a few different SKUs, probably 6 of them, which makes manufacturing so much easier, especially in 2021 and 2022, where supply chain is just absolute chaos. Now, if I had wanted to, and I did consider this, but honestly, it wouldn't have made that big of a difference, I considered going to the Max. Now, the Max is great because it doubles the amount of GPU power if you upgrade to it, but it also doubles the amount of those encoding, those special chipsets on the actual die. And so now you get 2 ProRes cores instead of 1. And so things like that can really exceed your workflows and have so much more powerful if you're trying to deal with a ton of video streams. Now, honestly, at a certain point, you gotta stop upgrading. And I think the Max, though it would have given me more power, I don't think I would have noticed that much. This thing still rinses through everything I need it to. And what's another 30 seconds on an encode time when it's this fast anyway? And so really that's why it's just important to think about your workflow before really getting into the hype about these laptops, because while they are incredibly powerful in some workflows and still very powerful overall, they're not that incredible next generation of power in every single workflow, and you might be disappointed. All right, well that's gonna be it for this somewhat ad hoc review. Go ahead and leave any other macOS tutorials you'd like to see me make in the comments below, and have a good one. Bye.